Getting to Grips with the Gospels. This is part 2 of our exploration of the Gospel of Matthew. Last week we spent some time looking at Matthew's audience, the nation of Israel, and the stories that they tell about themselves contained within the Torah, the Nevi'im and the Ketuvim, the Hebrew scriptures. We looked at how Matthew uses some of the details of Jesus' life and ministry to paint Jesus as the long-expected Messiah, and how he links the Old and the New Testaments together. We also spent some time looking at Matthew the tax collector, who is traditionally held to be the author of the Gospel. And we said that Matthew's message that Jesus is better than expected could be seen in that first meeting as Jesus chose to spend time with him and with his friends. And so we've covered quite a lot of ground already. But something we didn't do a lot of last week was actually spend time in the Gospel of Matthew. But don't panic, lose no more sleep, because this week we're going to be all up in that thing. So make sure you have your Bible at the ready. The groundwork is complete, the foundation laid, and we can finally begin to see how this gospel is constructed. And speaking of construction, that's where I want to start, because Matthew's design is incredible. First, let's look at the building blocks. I already mentioned in the introduction to the series a few weeks ago that Matthew borrows heavily from Mark, and that shouldn't give us any cause for concern. Matthew is simply using the resources that were available to him in order to tell the story of Jesus well. And it would appear that by the time Matthew got around to writing his gospel, Mark was already in circulation. But Mark wasn't Matthew's only source of information, because Matthew has a particular interest in teaching. And again, that's a very Jewish approach. Remember, when we looked at the Torah last week, it literally means teaching or instruction. And so scholars theorize that Matthew had another work that they refer to as the Q source that contained many of the sayings and teachings of Jesus. And both Matthew and Luke appear to borrow from this source, and that's because they have around 220 verses in common. Verses that are not found anywhere in Mark. Are you still with me? And of course, Matthew adds his own stuff as well that's unique to his gospel and his gospel alone. So in summary, Matthew's gospel is about 56% stuff from Mark, nearly the whole of Mark actually. 24% the Q source, which contained the sayings and teachings of Jesus, and around 20% stuff from Matthew's own tradition or perhaps own experience. And as wonderfully nerdy as all of that is, you might be asking, well, why does it matter? Well, it matters because it was Matthew's job to present all of this information in such a way that his audience could understand it. It's a bit like someone trying to present the end of year accounts, having received all the relevant information from the various department heads. And that is literally the most boring analogy I've ever used, so sorry. How does Matthew go about this then? Well, we already know that he borrows the narrative structure from Mark, but what about the teaching? Where does he put that? Does he just sort of shove it in wherever it'll fit? Well, no. He doesn't. Matthew actually uses Jesus' teaching very strategically. He gathers it together into 5 separate blocks, which we can recognize because each section closes with the same words. Matthew 7:28, when Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching. Matthew 11:1, after Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples, he went on from there to teach and preach in the towns of Galilee. Matthew 13:53, when Jesus had finished these parables, he moved on from there. Matthew 19:1, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee and went to the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. And Matthew 26, verses 1-2, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, as you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified. Each of those verses signifies the end of a block of teaching and the beginning of the next narrative section, leading into the next block of teaching. And what we have to remember is that when the Bible was created, there were no chapters and verses. They were added later on to make it easier to navigate. We mustn't assume that the next chapter is the next section. Far better to pay attention to the text and to look for those clues from the author. So Matthew arranges Jesus' teaching into these 5 sections. A bit like the 5 books of the Torah, right? I think Matthew might be winking at his Jewish audience again. But what I want to do today is just briefly take you through each section of teaching and try to answer 2 questions. Firstly, why does Matthew choose to focus on this aspect of Jesus' teaching here? And secondly, what does this have to say to us today? Because although the Bible wasn't written to us, it was written for us. So, let's dive in. Chapters 1 to 3, which we did look at a little bit last week, are essentially Matthew's introduction. Both the beginning and the end of Matthew's Gospel, there are loads of these allusions to the Hebrew Scriptures because Matthew wants his Jewish audience to recognize Jesus as the Messiah. We spoke about that last week. Chapters 4 to 7 are the beginning of Jesus' ministry in Galilee, and they lead to the first block of teaching. Chapter 4, verse 17 says, "From that time on, Jesus began to preach, 'Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near.'" And again in verse 23, Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness among the people. And this kingdom motif is key for us getting to grips with Matthew's Gospel. We're going to see it come up all the time. Jesus begins to gather people around him. He calls his first disciples, heals the sick, crowds come to hear him speak, and so he addresses them from this mountainside, and he begins to talk to them about this kingdom. Firstly, he tells them who the kingdom is for, and his list is surprising because it's not the usual suspects. It's not the rich or the powerful or the elite or the successful, the 1%, if you like. According to Jesus, the kingdom is for the poor in spirit, for those who mourn, for the meek, for those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for the merciful, for the pure in heart, for the peacemakers, and for those who are persecuted or insulted because of their allegiance to Jesus. The kingdom is for those who are on the bottom, not the top, those who are on the edge, not in the center. And Jesus begins to challenge those who think they're righteous, those who on the outside say and do all the right things, but who on the inside are kind of a mess. He says, "You have heard it said, 'Do not murder,' but if you're walking around with anger in your heart, that's an issue." He says, "You know not to commit adultery, but honestly, if you're leching at every person that walks by, that's an issue." He says, "You know not to break your oath, but if you're so untrustworthy you have to convince people you're telling the truth, that's an issue." And so the teaching that Matthew puts right up front, it's kind of a kingdom manifesto. Straight out of the gate, he wants his audience to know what kind of kingdom Jesus is establishing. And I can summarize it for you in 2 phrases. The kingdom is upside down and inside out. It's upside down because it looks for the outsider. It looks for the ones on the edge. It doesn't seek to stroke the egos of those in charge or give more power to the ones on top. Instead, it seeks to comfort the ones who mourn, to lift up those who have been trodden down. And it's inside out because it's about transformation of the heart, not about religious piety. In fact, Jesus goes on to criticize those who pray on the street corners or make a big show of fasting. "Oh, I'm so hungry, but, so holy and perfect." He says it's not about that. It's about what's going on in here. It's about who you are when nobody else is looking at you. And so the message for us then is this. The kingdom of heaven is for everyone, especially those who have been sidelined by others, but it's also deeply personal. It's meant to challenge us in ways we've never been challenged before. It calls into question our attitudes, our actions, and even our thoughts. If you want to get to grips with what the kingdom of heaven is all about, then Matthew chapters 5 to 7 is where you need to go. Read them again and again and another time after that. Because if you really think about and begin to apply these verses to your life, it has the power to change everything. And that's where we see Matthew going next in his gospel. In the next section, chapters 8 to 10, he begins to tell these stories of people who have been impacted by the kingdom. There is a man with leprosy who was ostracized by his community, but Jesus reaches out and touches him. There's a centurion who was the embodiment of Jewish oppression, who asks Jesus help with a sick servant, and Jesus gives it to him. There's Peter's mother-in-law who is sick. The disciples get caught in a storm. There's a couple of men who are demon-possessed and forced to live in a graveyard. There's a paralytic, a bleeding woman, a dead girl, and all of these people have their lives turned upside down through an encounter with Jesus. And then in chapter 10, the second block of teaching begins. And this time it's less of a preach and more of a commission. In fact, sometimes it's referred to as the Little Commission. It's cute, isn't it? In contrast to the Great Commission that we find at the end of Matthew's Gospel. And what Jesus is doing here is giving his disciples their first opportunity to not just be recipients of the kingdom, but bringers of the kingdom too. It says in chapter 10, verse 5, these 12, that's the disciples, Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Do not go amongst the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans. Rather go to the lost sheep of Israel. Clearly, Jesus thinks it's best they start with who they know. As you go, proclaim this message. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons, and freely you've received, so freely give. Easy peasy. No small task, is it? But the point is, they've witnessed Jesus bringing the kingdom into people's lives, but now it's time for them to get their hands dirty, to not just receive, but to give as well. But Jesus warns them it won't be a picnic. In fact, he says it's going to be tough, really tough. He even talks about how in some cases families may even turn against each other. Look at verse 25. It says, it's enough for students to be like their teachers and servants to be like their masters. If the head of the house has been called Beelzebul, then how much more the members of his household? And so Matthew wants his readers to know that the kingdom of heaven is not just something we receive, it's also something we're meant to give. But that's not always going to be plain sailing. In fact, in Matthew's context, he knew there were many in the Jewish community who did not accept Jesus as their Messiah and rejected those that did, even sometimes from the same family. And so you can see what this might have meant to them. And in our context, it might be the case that as we seek to love and support those who have been rejected, we also become victims of the persecution they have received. Similarly, people may just hate us because of our love for Jesus, but that's okay, because Jesus knows what we're going through. He encourages us to hold on. And sure enough, that's where the next section, chapters 11 to 13, go. It's all about people's response to Jesus and his disciples. There were those who were simply not prepared to listen. They wanted nothing to do with him. In fact, they wanted him gone. The Pharisees plot how they might kill him in chapter 12, verse 14. There were those who were unsure, like John the Baptist. Surprisingly, initially he was so certain, but now he's in prison and he has some questions. And so he sends his disciples to ask Jesus, are you the one who is to come, or should we expect someone else? Chapter 11, verse 3. There are those who support Jesus, but maybe have other concerns, like his family, who try to pull him away from his ministry in chapter 11, verse 46 and 47. And then there are those that seem to be recognizing Jesus as the Messiah, like those in chapter 12, verse 23, who were astonished and said, "Could this be the Son of David?" And at the end of this section of encounters, Matthew collects some of these parables of Jesus that were all about how we receive the kingdom of heaven. He opens with the parable of the soil. And in case you've never read it for yourself, there were 4 types of soil. The first soil is used as a path, and so it's hard and impenetrable. And so the seed that's sown there is quickly blown away or eaten by birds. The second soil is shallow because the ground is rocky, and so the seed takes, but in the heat the plant dies because the roots are short. The third soil is full of thorns that suffocate and choke the seeds of the plants as they grow. And the fourth soil is receptive, deep and clear of thorns, so seeds can grow and multiply many times. And then, to hammer home the point, Jesus explains that the seeds are the message about the kingdom. Can you see how the parable directly relates to the people in the previous chapters? The Pharisees are impenetrable. John is feeling a bit rocky. His family are kind of weedy, and his followers are multiplying. Coincidence? I don't think so. And all the other parables in this section have a similar theme. Stories of crops growing among weeds, yeast spreading through dough, mustard seeds producing massive trees. Matthew wants his audience to know that in the right conditions, the ideas of this new kingdom will continue to grow and spread and produce much in our world. The challenge for us then is to ask, what type of soil are we? Is the kingdom of heaven multiply and growing in our lives, or is it perhaps being strangled by other things? 3 down, 2 to go. I know we are very much taking a bird's eye view today, and probably we could spend months preaching on each section of teaching found in Matthew. There's so much to discover there, but my hope is that by understanding what Matthew is trying to do, when you read the details for yourself, you'll find it more compelling. So the next section is from chapters 14 to 20, and there's a lot that happens here. I think this section is best described as surprising, but in the best way. So, for example, in chapter 14, the disciples tell Jesus to send the crowds away because it's getting late and they're hungry, but instead Jesus says, "You give them something to eat." That was a surprise. And then when the disciples flounder, he ends up feeding them himself with 5 loaves and 2 fish. No one was expecting that. Later on in the chapter, the disciples get into trouble on the water. There's a storm, and so Jesus walks over to them. And the disciples are so surprised that they think he's a ghost, and they end up crying out in fear. In chapter 15, Jesus heals the daughter of a Canaanite woman, which was surprising because the Jews and the Canaanites didn't get along at all. And it all culminates with this surprise reveal in chapter 16 when Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" And the disciples, they're like, well, they're not sure really. Some say John the Baptist, who'd lost his head by this point. Others say Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. But then Jesus turns it on them. "What about you? Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus praises him for his answer. "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, because this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven." But although Peter knew who Jesus was, he didn't yet know what that meant. Because Jesus immediately starts to talk about his suffering and his death. And Peter says, "No, never, never, Lord, this shall never happen to you." You see, he had these expectations of the Christ, of the Messiah, and suffering and death were not a part of that picture. And so the next section of teaching is all about Jesus reversing those expectations. It's really surprising, but in the best way. Jesus speaks of the greatest in the kingdom of heaven being like a little child, someone who is often overlooked or seemingly unimportant. He speaks about offering forgiveness to one another, not 7 times, but 77 times, of forgiving others as we have been forgiven by God. He spoke to the rich young ruler about selling his possessions and giving it all to the poor. He spoke about the first being last and the last being first. He said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. And what Matthew is doing here is reminding his audience that although Jesus' actions and teaching may have been surprising, this is what the kingdom of heaven is really all about. It's not about privileging ourselves or looking after our own interest. It's about serving one another, about forgiving one another, about loving our neighbour as ourselves. The sad truth is that sometimes the church is surprising, but in the wrong way. Surprisingly similar to the world around it. Surprisingly exclusive. Surprisingly judgmental. Surprisingly unforgiving, more concerned with how it leads rather than how it serves. And I think this section of teaching is as relevant for us today as it was back then. We need to make sure that we're surprising in the best way, in the Jesus way. And then we arrive at our final section, chapters 21 to 25. Essentially, this is where the story reaches its climax. Up until now, we've seen the kingdom of heaven causing these ripples all over the place. People finding new life, new hope in Jesus. But as we come to the end of Matthew's gospel, the kingdom of heaven comes face to face with the kingdom of man. We find Jesus entering the temple, driving out the moneylenders. He starts telling these parables, these stories that speak of the religious leaders' failure to embrace the kingdom of heaven for themselves. And then he finally confronts them head on in chapter 23. He calls them out for their hypocrisy, their injustice, their sycophantic displays of personal piety while inside they rot and decay. There's some really good insults in chapter 23. If you ever find yourself composing a letter to someone who has gotten on your nerves, then have a look. I mean, obviously don't send the letter, pray for them, but, for therapy. Then Jesus has his disciples look at the temple and its buildings, and he says, do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another, every one will be thrown down. And he warns them of many more difficult times ahead, but he also encourages them to hold on to the kingdom values, especially when times are tough, to stand up for injustice, to feed the hungry, to welcome the stranger, to care for the sick and visit the prisoner. And here Matthew wants his readers to continue to hold on and to continue to stand up for what is right, even in the toughest of times. And we too should pursue kingdom values above everything else, especially in our world that is so full of hatred and war and famine and disaster. Seek first the kingdom of heaven, Jesus says, and I'll take care of everything else. Matthew's epilogue in chapters 26 to 28, of course, tell of Jesus' death and resurrection, and they provide the ultimate proof of the power of the kingdom of heaven. Such is its authority that even death cannot stand in its way. On the cross, Jesus demonstrates the true nature of the upside-down kingdom as one person gives himself up for everyone, even those who do not deserve it. He freely gives himself for us and pushes back against injustice. And the surprise, of course, is that death cannot hold him. Through his sacrifice, all nations are welcomed into his kingdom. Do you see how deftly and expertly Matthew weaves this story together to reveal the kingdom of heaven to his readers and to us? It's beautiful. And each section of teaching presents many ideas and challenges that help us to become better followers of Christ. as we seek to love him from the inside out, to turn this world upside down by freely giving what we have freely received, to surprise the world by revealing the kingdom of heaven in our actions and deeds as we push against injustice and love our enemies as ourselves. This is exciting stuff. This is what the life of faith is all about, and Matthew gifts it to us in these 28 incredible chapters. And he finishes with Jesus' words, "Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always, to the very end of the age." This story is yours now to carry with you wherever you go. May King Jesus reign in your heart and his kingdom change the world through your actions.